a conductive wire, and you were so electric. I had no say when you came so near, and just passed right through me. I was a magnetic pole.
Hey everyone, before we dive into today's episode, I wanted to let you know that you can follow Welcome to Geekdom on Instagram at Welcome to Geekdom and on Twitter at GeekdomPod. There are links to those in the show notes. You can also support the show on Patreon, where I will be releasing bonus content for this podcast and my other podcast, Chat Cemetery. You can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts or on Podchaser. There are links to all of those things in the show notes, so be sure to do that. It is a huge help for the show, and I really appreciate it. Now, let's dive into today's episode. Hey everyone, Welcome to Geekdom is back. I'm your host, Deanna Chapman, and today I am joined by Murjani Rawls, and we are talking all about Blade, the 1998 movie. I didn't realize this was so old, MJ.
Yeah, it feels like 1998 is a lifetime away.
Yeah, it really is. But what I was really surprised by was how great this cast is, because I went into this having never seen it. All I knew was that Wesley Snipes was Blade. I did not know that Stephen Dorff was, sort of the main villain, and that Chris Christopherson was in this, Donal Logue, and just so many other familiar faces throughout this. And, I apologize if I am mispronouncing her name, but Bushy Wright was fantastic as Karen, and it just all came together really well. And even though, some of the effects are certainly dated now in 2021 when we're discussing this, it was still a very fun time.
Oh, so you just saw it recently?
Yeah, I literally watched it last night for the first time.
Oh, nice. The first time that I saw it was, I think my uncle got it on VHS. Because he's a huge like kung fu fan, and he was a huge like Wesley Snipes fan too. So yeah, I didn't get to see it in theaters. I was like way too young, but I watched it on VHS and I loved it. I mean, it was an R-rated movie, which was at the time unheard of. Like it's because like you think of like the MCU now as being like this uber successful, like every movie is going to hit a benchmark of $1 billion or something around there. Well, not in Blade's time. Like it was making a superhero film was very risky. And the fact that like New Line Cinema took a chance on this and that it was a big hit. It made, $70 million at the US box office and 131 worldwide for an R-rated film back then. That was really good. And in turn, it really showed it showed studios that superhero films can be profitable.
Yeah, and I just want to give a little correction on Bushy Right. So definitely mispronounced that. I should have looked that up before we started this. But, also directed by Stephen Norrington, written by David S. Goyer, who we know for some other superhero-related movies that we didn't like quite as much. But I think one of the things that really stood out to me while I was watching this was just how well Wesley Snipes had down sort of those superhero moves and poses. It's campy at times, but it works with this movie, and this really made me want like a MCU horror edition.
Well, I mean, fingers crossed. I think we're getting that. Maybe starting with Morbius in January, and I know Blade is in production now. I know David S. Goyer, he's written, Blade 1, 2, and 3. He's also written on, the Dark Knight trilogy, Man of Steel, Batman vs. Superman. So, he's very well-versed in superhero genre. I believe that this was the first comic book film that he wrote on. And for that to be kind of like his stamp on like the Marvel universe, and taking a Marvel character that's not as well known as like the Spider-Mans, the X-Men and stuff like that, and making it a hit, and then having Wesley Snipes, who just oozes that cool factor. You know what I mean? Like, he's very stoic. Yeah. He doesn't show like a lot of emotion. He's very committed to the goal of killing all vampires. But he has his quirks, like especially like in the beginning of the movie where like the cops shoot him in in that hospital scene where he's like, "Motherfucker, you out of your damn mind!" Like, it's like outbursts like that, and then like some of his one-liners, like, sometimes motherfuckers skate uphill, like, you know what I mean? Like, I skate uphill. Like, he definitely embodied that character.
Absolutely. And if we take a quick look at David S. Goyer's track record, he's done stuff in the horror world prior to this. You know, you have some science fiction stuff too, and this kind of blends a little bit of both of those things. Although the science fiction in this is not quite as big as some of the other movies he's done, like, you know, the Puppet Masters and whatnot. But this felt like David Goyer's sweet spot almost, because it blended horror with the superhero element and a little bit of sci-fi magical kind of stuff happening too. And, you know, probably our least favorite of the mentions, Batman versus Superman. I know there are things to like about that movie, but as far as that stuff goes, and, you know, even Ghost Rider Spirit of Vengeance, which I don't think I've seen, but I'll be interested to go check that out now that I have seen Blade especially. And
I've seen it. It's a very interesting sequel. I will say. I'll just say that.
Yeah, I need to go back and watch the first one. I think I've seen the first one for the Ghost Rider movies, but not that one. So I think, you know, this is a movie that hit at the right time for that sort of horror and superhero thing. Because like you said, it made $131 million overall. The budget was $45 million. Like I said, some of those effects look very much like video game effects now almost. And it still worked for me. And, you know, the story behind this, we see the birth of Blade, if you will. He thinks his mother has been dead all of these years, and now he is going and finding out all of this stuff that he didn't know about before. He kind of knew about Frost and, you know, that this war was coming, but then he finds out his mother did not die all of those years ago, and she was actually turned and, from the looks of it, stopped aging shortly after giving birth to him.
Yeah. When I was like looking up things for this movie, like some of the casting choices would have been really interesting, because I know at first when they were developing the movie, like as early as the 1990s, like LL Cool J was supposed to be Blade, and they wanted Jet Li to be Deacon Frost, but he chose to do Lethal Weapon 4. So, I mean, I think that they did the right thing settling with Wesley Snipes to Stephen Dorff. They definitely act off of each other well, especially with Deacon Frost is the villain, but there's also this dynamic of old vampires and new vampires and purebloods and those who are turned, and like there's that little side story that kind of keeps his storyline going. Yeah, I mean, and also with the dynamic with Blade, because he's half vampire, half human, so like he has all of their strengths and none of their weaknesses, so he can walk out in daylight. There's a scene where we watched it, and I'm like, how is Frost out in the sunlight? And I'm like, oh, it's just as simple as like him putting on
a ton of sunscreen and looking
a
super
ton of sunscreen.
pale.
like I'm like, okay, then like why do they need Blade in his blood for? They could just put a ton of sunscreen on and be okay, apparently. So Yeah, that was a little wacky, but all in all, like with how the movie kind of unveils itself, especially with Blade's relationship with Whistler, and how they have a father-son relationship, even though they're kind of cold to each other. I like how the movie enters the audience as events that are already happening. Like, Blade and Whistler have been on this crusade to rid the world of vampires for quite a while. Like, the vampires have insulated themselves in all forms of society. They're cops. Then there's, like, I guess human concubines that, like, work for them and stuff like that. So, like, instead of it being an origin story, like, the movie is smart and it takes the audience at face value and saying, like, no, all this is already happening. Like, when Blade shows up in the first scene in the club, everybody's, like, afraid. Everybody's in awe of him, which I thought was badass.
Yeah, it's really like we're going on this journey with Karen, not Blade, because she's thrown into it in the midst of all this, just like the audience is. And I thought that was pretty clever because it kind of shifts your perspective, because we don't know a ton about Blade. She doesn't know a ton about Blade. And even though we got that opening scene of the birth and, his mom having been bitten and bleeding out all over the place from her neck, there's no real context given to us in that moment. And we get all of that sort of as Karen and Blade are getting more of that information. And I still think most of it comes from Karen's perspective because, we do spend quite a bit of time with her when she's used as bait. And I love that they also introduced familiars in this, which is something when I think about familiars, I think more of like witches, like Salem in Sabrina and stuff like that.
Yeah, the cop. The pesky cop that goes around and he kind of like Officer Krieger.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's like, okay, this is a familiar. Another thing that I like, especially with Karen, she gets bitten in the beginning of the movie, and they somehow like administer kind of like a serum to keep her from turning. But in turn, because Blade seems like this unstoppable killing machine, you find out that he takes a serum to suppress his thirst for blood, and he's building a tolerance to it. And the movie comes full circle where, he gets worn down, and it's kind of like this all is lost moment where Deacon Frost is summoning La Magra, the blood god, and he has to return drinking blood in order to regain his powers or of some sort, which I thought like was a really cool like full circle moment that they introduced.
Yeah, and we obviously cannot talk about this movie without talking about the fight scenes, because I mentioned how some of the effects looked a little video game-like, and you do get a little bit of that in the fight scenes when he suddenly like stops to pose almost, but at the same time, it was not only fitting for the time, but those fights were actually really well done. You have that big scene at the underground club that's like in the back of a meat packing plant or something kind of crazy like that. And that moment that Blade shows up, you just know something is going to go down because it's a room full of people, more specifically vampires, which you realize once you see like the big bloodbath sign and then you see the sprinklers go off with all of the blood coming out of them. And I just thought that was really great imagery too, to introduce Blade.
It is an R-rated film, so it does have like it is very, no pun intended, bloody.
Yes.
Like it's a vampire movie, like the movie starts with like a big blood rave of vampires drinking blood from like a sprinkler system. You know what I mean? Like that's how the movie starts. There's like almost a division between the gore, but also the stylish way of how like Blade kills vampires, like they kind of disappear into ash. I think they perfect it more in Blade 2. It looks a little bit cooler. Of course, that's, like Del Toro also. But yeah, I think that like it's like you said, like it's a video gamey type deaths that they all go through. The fight scenes I love. They're fierce, they're brutal. A little tidbit is that the fight scene at the end between Blade and Frost when he becomes the Blood God, that was actually not originally in the movie. They added that with reshoots. Like, I thought it was interesting because like the movie was originally supposed to end with that scene where Frost becomes like the Blood God or La Magra. And that's how the movie was supposed to end. And then test audiences hated it. So they went ahead and added that fight scene, which I love. I love the shots where like Blade is doing stuff with the sword, and then like Frost is kind of mimicking him, and then with like that single vial of the serum and how he like kicks it into his forehead. Like, I thought that was pretty badass too.
Yeah, not to mention all of the weapons that he has. He obviously has the big sword, and we find out that it can do some other things too, and it blows up a few hands here and there. And, he has his silver stakes, if you will, and just the fact that you see how prepared he is and how much of a beating he's willing to take, because he's taking on so many of them at once, and he's only one person, quote unquote person anyway. And, having Whistler come in and shoot up the place that had all of, what did they call it? It was like the vampire Bible, basically. It had these massive pages. Like, these pages were so big. They were at least like 3 feet by 2 feet. Like, this must have been an insanely huge book. And Whistler just comes in, shooting up the place, makes a comment about how he's too old for this. And, they have a little bit of banter to bring some levity to this because of how gory it is, because of how dark it is. And I think that worked really well, because there are some moments where you find yourself laughing, and it's not this movie that's taking itself too seriously. It certainly knows that it is this big superhero and vampire movie.
Oh, it's definitely comical. It's definitely meta at some points, especially with the vampire lore. I've always felt that, I'm trying to pronounce his name, his character name, because Udo Kier is in there. He's the vampire elder. Oh, Dragonetti. So, like, I always felt that, like, and again, watching that movie of Deacon Frost, kind of like this, like, punk vampire who thinks he knows everything, but he was never brought up as a vampire. He was turned by somebody.
Yeah. And
the fact that, like, he's coming at Dragonetti and all these elders and ultimately brutally killing Dragonetti, too. Like, he removes his teeth and he has him burned in the sunlight, which, again, they're dressed in, like, those motorcycle helmets in all black.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, like, again, like, you could just walk around like this and everything would be fine. But, yeah. But I thought that was very kind of on the ball of, like, the old ways of, like, what you think of vampirism is, like, these, like, or the old ways of thinking that they had, like, we'll live with the humans, we'll work with them, we'll have a treaty, and, like, Deacon Frost is like, no, like, we feed on humans. We literally cannot die. We, like, regenerate and everything like that. So, like, why are we doing this? We should be ruling over them. So, like, that kind of warring sense of ideologies was pretty cool. And then you just have Blade, who said, like, kill them all. Like, I just want them all dead.
Yeah, this was definitely a movie that took me by surprise, because I knew that people I've talked to about other superhero movies had seen this, and I never really looked on Letterboxd or anything to see what the people I follow there and what my friends had rated it. So I was pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed this. And another thing that surprised me, though, is the character named Pearl. I was not expecting this giant blob of a character who kind of reminded me of Jabba the Hutt in, this form to appear as like the tech person in this.
Oh, yeah. Pearl, of course, is like the mode in the movie that, they're looking for information and then, they have to kind of torture him to get it out. You know what I mean? Like it's, and ultimately they get it out of him to find out who the blood god is and why Frost is trying to bring the blood god back. I thought it was like a nice little like break in the action, and like you're like, ew, man, like who's this character who like looks at all like the vampire text and like all the information here and things like that. Like the character design for Pearl was really was interesting to say the least, I would say.
Yeah, and this didn't come across in the movie, but there's this little trivia fact, and it says the director of the film, Stephen Norrington, stated the cause of Pearl's obese size was the creature gaining a cannibalistic lust for infants and children as he loves to eat their hearts. How pleasant.
Oh, great.
Yeah, fantastic.
Tasty. Another tidbit. There's a deleted scene, and the director is actually Morbius. You could look it up on YouTube. I know because you are very eagerly anticipating the Sony Jared Leto Morbius coming out in January. But yes, there's supposed to be a tie-in there that they killed.
That's kind of a bummer because this definitely could have been the start of this sort of horror universe for Marvel, and the fact that, Sony now has the rights to Morbius, because, this was by no means a Sony movie. It was like you said, New Line Cinema, Marvel. So it was well before all of the MCU and everything like that happening. And it's one of those what if scenarios where you're kind of like, okay, but what if they had done Morbius when they did Blade? And, maybe we don't have 3 Blade movies. Maybe we have 1 or 2 Blade movies and a Morbius movie, and sort of see where that goes. And obviously now we have Venom 2 that sort of leans into horror elements a bit more. And while I do think we are getting more horror type movies from Marvel, I think they're still going to rely heavily on sort of connecting a bunch of these things. And obviously, like, Blade and Morbius is a connection that makes sense. Whereas, like Blade and Venom wouldn't really make sense or something like that. So I would kind of love to see more standalone things like this in a sense too. Because when I said I was left wanting like this MCU horror edition, I didn't necessarily mean in the same way that the MCU has all of these movies connected. Because one, that's a lot of work, not only for the people working on the movies, but for fans too. I know people love keeping up with all of the Easter eggs and stuff like that, but for me, I get exhausted doing that and keeping track of, okay, this one little scene that we saw in the Avengers gets called back to in this other thing, and it's just too much sometimes.
Yeah, I don't really know what the plan, because presumably, spoiler alert, after the events of Venom, Let There Be Carnage, Venom is in the MCU now. And we don't know what's really going to happen with Spider-Man No Way Home. So if you looked at the Morbius trailer, it's referencing 3 different Spider-Man universes. It's referencing the MCU verse, the Garfield verse, and the original Raimi verse. So it's like, okay, where is this in the lore? Blade, I mean, the MCU Blade is coming, and the connection between Morbius and Blade would be a no-brainer because they're both in each other's comics. You know what I mean? Like it's, like I believe that, like, Morbius bites him in Spider-Man comic and gives him like super speed and strength. So that would be a no-brainer to me, but I have no idea what Marvel is and Sony are doing. I think that will be more clear once we see Spider-Man No Way Home in December. So until then, it's just kind of guessing. But in terms of this movie and looking back, like you said, like it's nice to know, like it's nice to watch a movie or a superhero film and everything is not connected, and then there's like a super secret, teaser at the end. It's just kind of in its own little universe. And that's why I think, I love Blade 2 even more, but like this kind of created an appetite for like, all right, cool. Like not only can we do superhero films, we can do them very gritty. And like you see that now with Deadpool and Logan, maybe Birds of Prey, like, R-rated films in the superhero verse have a market. You know what I mean? Like they can be successful.
Yeah, they absolutely can. And the fact that this was back in the late 90s and then early 2000s for the sequels, just goes to show that there is a place for this. And, we kind of saw that with Deadpool too, because that was rated R and not necessarily tied directly to anything when it came out. But, to go back to the story a little, Frost wanted to essentially incite war between vampires and humans, and Karen stays by Blade's side and at the end of it offers to cure him, and he's like, no, instead make me a better serum, and that sort of sets up the sequel. And I think, it was great to have that there because it still could have ended that way. It didn't have to have a sequel necessarily with that ending. It wasn't like they left a ton of loose ends because Blade does go after Frost. He does stop him, at least, it appears so. And you have all of the elders who have been dealt with then. So it's really just this nice wrapped up story that still leaves you wanting more because of how interesting both Blade and Karen are, and you want to see what journey they go on next.
I think that works partly because the setup between Blade and Whistler, and that's in the performances of Wesley Snipes and Christopherson, because they're two very headstrong guys. You'll never hear them say like "I love you" or like "I love you, Dad" or "I love you, son" or something like that. Like that'll never come out of them, especially when Blade finds that Whistler's been bitten. Whistler gives him the gun and just says, or it tells him to give me the goddamn gun, and then says like "walk the F away." And yeah, you know what I mean? Like that's the extent, like, that they love each other, but also Blade loses his mentor. Like Blade loses the guy that helps him makes all his weapons. So at the end of the film, when you find him in Moscow, like with that badass scene where he like says something in Russian and like pulls out a sword, like it's dope. Like it's also, and I know it gets undone in Blade 2, which if we talk about Blade 2, we could talk more about that. Where like I know some of my friends who've seen Blade 2 aren't really happy with that choice, but just from this film, it's like, okay, like Blade is on his own. He's gonna have to. He has a new set of problems where he's world hopping or country hopping to find vampires in other countries and other places, but he has to do it alone. While like it's presumed that Jensen is making a stronger serum for him.
So that definitely works really well as, okay, we know there's potential for more here. And I don't know if they knew when this movie came out that they would have two more, or if it was dependent on this movie's success, because, you know, now we're so used to sequels, and especially, you know, in the superhero genre, it's not something that's uncommon for horror, for instance, because we've been getting sequels since the 70s and 80s with Halloween, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, Child's Play, so on and so forth. Basically every horror franchise you can think of, that's when all of the sequels started. And with this, you can tell that they were like, we're just going to try this thing. It's going to be out there. It's going to be dark. It's going to be superhero mashed up with horror. And it worked. And I'm actually kind of surprised how long it took to get, you know, more Marvel stuff going other than X-Men in between, you know, like Blade and Iron Man.
Yeah, I mean, like, it was made for a $45 million budget, which now we're like, you know, they make, if you put like 6 Paranormal Activities together, you might get 45 million in a budget. That's like maybe a fifth of what they make for superhero films now, but 45 million on a superhero film back then was a risk. Like,
yeah,
you may not make that back. For it to make over like 130 million worldwide, like that was a good validation of, okay, like, we can make these films. People care about, you know, superheroes and stuff like that outside of like the made for TV movies that were on like CBS and things like that, with like the bad costumes and stuff. Like, all right, we can actually put money into this and they'll work. Absolutely.
And one other thing I want to quickly talk about here is the fact that you have Quinn, who is this minion of Frost, and he just keeps coming back for more, and it never goes well for him. You know, he gets his arms partially chopped off, he gets new hands, and then he gets, you know, completely destroyed by the end. He gets burned up, and he goes through so much in this movie. You almost want to feel bad for him, but you can't, because he's also just so dumb.
That's another aspect that I really like, is that, like, when Quinn and Blade meet each other for the first time in the movie, it's hinted at, like, he's taken limbs from him before. So he's like, okay, like, am I taking an arm? And then, like, when Quinn is back and, like, scared of Blade, he's like, he took my hand again. You know what I mean? Like, I really like that aspect, because, like, where Frost is very serious about this goal, and he has his girlfriend and all this stuff like that. Quinn just is a vampire that wants to party. That's what he wants to do. He lives in this lavish lifestyle of being a vampire and kind of just living it up.
Yeah, and, you know, Frost is kind of like that too, but he's more calculated. He knows what he's doing, or at least he thinks he does until the end. But you have just these completely different personalities between these two characters that are really supposed to be working together. And I think, you know, that kind of gives you a little tension here and there too, because Quinn keeps screwing up and Frost is kind of like, fine, I'll do everything myself, sort of thing. And, you know, even I believe the character's name is Raquel. You know, she is someone who sort of just brings this human in, and it does not work as planned. You also have Mercury, and she is not super helpful. She's a little more helpful than Raquel, and there's just so much about this movie that I enjoyed, and just that juxtaposition there between Frost, who is in charge, and then all of these people under him who kind of don't have their priorities straight. And, Raquel maybe less so because she was only in it early on and we don't really see her again from what I remember. But you know what her purpose is right away. And then she just kind of goes off and does her own thing and does not keep track of this human she brought into the rave. So that was, another thing I noticed throughout this.
I mean, like when it's in the contrast of where everybody meets. So like the elders meet in like this underground basement with a big table and, like big sterile table. It's dark. They meet for business and they talk about, money accounts while, the new vampires or the turned vampires live in like beautiful apartments. They go to clubs, they go out, they live like young people, like invincible young people. It's a cool contrast. And then you have Blade, who lives in just a big warehouse with an old man. So it's like, I like that there were distinct environments also within a New York City landscape. Like the first time that, Blade and Frost meet each other, I think it's within Central Park during the day. Like people are like out jogging, out with friends. Meanwhile, there's like this hostage situation with a little girl that Frost has. Like, I like that the world of Blade is very ingratiated into society just seamlessly. Like, people are just like living their lives, doing their thing. Oh, by the way, there are vampires around.
Yeah. Also, here's a shootout on the street. All right, it's over. We'll just continue walking.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess it is New York, but like at the same time, like, you just saw like a dude run like through the street in super speed, and they're just like, all right, well, I got this like train to catch. I got to go.
And honestly, big cities like New York have always kind of felt like that in a sense. It's like everyone has somewhere to go, has something to do, and they aren't going to wait for anyone, really. There's just sort of this fast pace about certain big cities, especially on the East Coast, I would say. And, maybe it's because sometimes it gets really cold and you don't want to linger outside. I feel that. I was in Philly for a few years, I know you feel that too, but...
Blade, I don't think that it would hit if it was like made in like North Dakota or something.
Yeah,
like that would
exactly.
Be like John Carpenter's Vampires or something like that.
Yeah. And, I don't think I have too much else to say about this one. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up here?
I mean, it was one of the first superhero movies that I got to watch, probably a little too soon because I was like really young when I saw it. Sorry, Mom and Dad, but I mean, I enjoy it. Like every time that it comes on, I watch it. It's just like one of those things. Like I think somebody said, like every time Dark Knight comes on TNT, I find myself just sitting down and watching it. It's the same thing with Blade. Like I'm very glad that not only Blade as a African American lead succeeded, it paved the way for superheroes and like also films like Black Panther.
Yeah.
And the fact that like you can have minority led superhero films and in general, and they could be profitable and people will receive them. Like I'm super thankful for this movie.
Yeah, it really did a lot for the superhero genre, and I want to do some recommendations here. And if you dig the vampire vibe of this movie, I'm going to recommend Dr. Sleep, because even though those vampires are a little different, they're sort of, these quasi-immortal vampires, and they go after steam instead of blood necessarily. It's just another fun vampire horror story, in my opinion. But MJ, how about you? Any recs?
I just want to say that Rebecca Ferguson is amazing in that movie. Oh, you put me on the spot here for vampire recs. I'm going to have to go. Well, that I'm a fan of this specifically with Stephen King. So I'm going to recommend for my recommendation the TV miniseries of Salem's Lot. That scene where the vampire boy emerges out of like through the window at night.
Are we talking the 1979 one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I know they're redoing it.
They've redone it once already, so I wanted to clarify whether we were talking 79 or 2004, and then there's an upcoming one. So many Salem's Lots.
Yeah, not the 2004 one. But like run to the 1979 one. I think it's on like DVD if you still use DVDs for like $9.99. I think it's also on Prime. You could rent for like $3. It's a nice little miniseries. Tobe Hooper is the director. If you don't know who Tobe Hooper is, he did Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah.
He also did Poltergeist.
Body Bags. Fun stuff.
Body Bags. Life Force. Yeah. I love that miniseries. So if you're in for some late Halloween stuff, please, seek it. Watch that movie.
Yeah. Well, those are our Stephen King recommendations for my non-Stephen King podcast. So go check those out, and then you can listen to the episodes of Chat Cemetery on them, because I definitely have done episodes for both of those. It works out,
Look at that, like full circle. Circle.
Exactly. Well, Murjani, thank you so much for joining me to talk about Blade. We will definitely cover Blade 2 and Blade Trinity, and this should be a fun little series of Blade movies to discuss.
Yeah, it's going to be fun talking about Blade Trinity and all the stuff that went down with that movie.
Well, I look forward to it. Thank you again.